January 24th, 2023, 0400 hours. The temperature on the South Donetsk plains sits below freezing. From the outside, the high-rise towers of Vuhledar look completely abandoned. But behind the hollowed-out frames waits a Ukrainian anti-tank squad. Their eyes are locked on the southern approach, waiting for the Russian armor to come. Suddenly the skies light up from BM-21 Grad multiple rocket launchers alongside TOS-1A Scorching Sun thermobaric launchers, aiming to turn the city's high-rise apartment buildings into piles of rubble. On the ground, T-80 tanks roll across the blanket of snow that lines the ground, with infantry from the 155th and 40th Brigades, along with the 36th Motorized Rifle Brigade and other specialized units following behind, rushing towards Vuhledar from the southeast and southwest directions. For the Russians, this is it, the moment they've been building to, and the success or failure of their mission depends on speed and strength. For them to succeed, this cannot devolve into a grinding battle of attrition. It has to be swift and surgical in its execution, with Russia hoping to implement a lightning strike assault, rushing through the open fields around the city, finding cover among the dachas and other small buildings on its outskirts, and then storming the center before Ukraine's defenders even know what hit them. This is the strategy of Colonel General Rustam Muradov, commander of the Eastern Military District. There's an enormous amount riding on this battle for Muradov and the Kremlin war machine, and the general hopes that the sheer numbers of troops and mass of armor at his disposal will be enough to achieve the win he so sorely needs. But Muradov's plan utterly ignores the lessons that should have been learned in Pavlivka. There, Russia's assault troops and armored columns, moving along predictable paths in predictable formations, were intercepted and destroyed by Ukrainian defenders. And the exact same thing starts happening in Vuhledar. Muradov orders his huge armoured columns to advance along the few paved roads and dirt tracks that still provide passage to the city, with tanks leading the way and BMP fighting vehicles rolling behind. Taking advantage of their elevation, Ukrainian spotters see the enemy coming from afar, following the exact routes they expected, the very same routes they've already lined with mines and locked onto with their artillery systems, which are safely positioned several miles away. The Ukrainians barely need to move. They simply watch and wait as the Russians roll right into their traps. And the Russians have no choice but to drive blindly into these pre-sighted artillery zones. If you look here at the flat, featureless plains to the south, you'll see why advancing on Vuhledar leaves an attacking force without a single inch of cover. Once a thriving mining town, Vuhledar is now a shattered ruin after being repeatedly bombarded by Russian rockets and artillery fire since the Kremlin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began barely a year prior. But those early attacks are about to pale in significance compared to what comes next. After months of grinding effort, some of the Russian army's most elite units from the 155th Guards Naval Infantry Brigade and the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade are closing in on the city. With dozens of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles at their disposal, this massive mechanized assault group has been given one clear objective: capture Vuhledar by any means necessary. In their way stand the brave defenders of Ukraine's 72nd Separate Mechanized Brigade, who have dug in and defended this location for many months and have no intention of giving up even a single foot of ground without a serious fight. They may be outnumbered and outgunned, but they have one all-important advantage over the Russians: terrain. Vuhledar sits in a highly elevated area, allowing Ukraine's soldiers to see the Russians coming and track their every movement. With a clear line of sight on their enemies, the Ukrainian forces can, to some extent, control the battlefield, laying down suppressing fire and funneling the Russians into narrow routes and tight choke points, the kinds of places where Ukraine's limited stocks of mines, artillery and anti-tank weapons can make all the difference. It's a tactic they've used before, but it's never been tried against a force of this size. This will be a critical test of both sides' tactics. The biggest tank battle of the Russia-Ukraine war is about to begin, and the fate of one of the most strategically valuable cities in the conflict hangs in the balance. Situated in the southern part of the Donetsk region, roughly 35 miles from Donetsk city, Vuhledar, which translates to gift of coal in English, was home to over 14,000 people before the war began, though its population soon plummeted to just a few hundred by the time the Russians arrived at the city gates. It was once intended to become one of the biggest mining cities in the country, with plans to build 10 mines in total and bring in around 100,000 people from far and wide to fuel the city's growth and development. Those plans never quite came to fruition, though a couple of mines were still built here, and the city remained a small but still noteworthy economic node for the broader Donbass region. The city may not have seemed all that important to a casual observer, but from a military perspective, Vuhledar had two critical factors in its favour. The first was its elevation. It was built on a high plain. It's the highest point in the entire area, gazing out across flat, featureless plains in almost every direction. There are no forests to hide in. There are no hills or contours for cover. This made it much easier to defend than the dozens of surrounding towns and villages that were dotted amongst the plains. Vuhledar's elevation made it impossible to stage any sort of ambush or surprise assault on the city, because the defenders could always see the enemy coming. The second important aspect of Vuhledar was its strategic location. It's located close to major road and rail routes. To the north, for example, is the N15 highway, linking the major cities of Donetsk and Zaporizhia. To the south, meanwhile, sits a major railway line running through to the occupied city of Mariupol and onward to the Crimean Peninsula. Vuhledar was just close enough that Ukraine could effectively use artillery to fire on Russian supply trains heading to those locations. So if Russia could take hold of the city, not only would it be able to move supplies more safely via the railway, but its forces would also be able to push onwards towards other Ukrainian strongholds like Kurakova and Pokrovsk to the north. This is why a seemingly insignificant city mattered so much. It wasn't just any other town. It was a stronghold, supply node and lookout post all in one, with real influence across the entire surrounding areas of southern and central Donetsk. The Russian command knows a frontal assault across these plains is a death sentence. They know this because 3 months earlier, they already tried it. October 2022. Russia's commander's ultimate aim is to capture Vuhledar and push on towards their next big targets, but they know that a frontal assault on the city would devolve into a bloodbath, so they came up with a plan. Rather than rushing straight towards the Hilltop fortress, they decided to slowly encircle the city, first taking over the smaller villages that surround it before closing in on Vuhledar itself, using a pincer movement to squeeze the city's defenders until they break. To do that, they first have to take control of Pavlivka, a little village sitting in a low-lying location to the south of Vuhledar. And so in late October, units from the 155th are ordered to march on Pavlivka, relying primarily on infantry-heavy tactics supported by armoured vehicles to shatter Ukrainian supply lines and burst through their defences. They thought it would be easy. They miscalculated. Within the opening hours of the initial assault, the flaws in Russia's plan began to emerge. Pavlivka is clearly visible from the high-rise buildings of Vuhledar, where Ukrainian spotters sit and watch the Russian tanks, vehicles and assault groups rush towards the village, providing real-time intelligence to their comrades to the south. The Ukrainian units, firmly entrenched in fortified locations, make use of M777 howitzers and anti-tank weapons to repel the enemy's advances, making use of the open terrain that surrounds the village to destroy the exposed Russian vehicles. Within days, the 155th has lost hundreds of men, and in a rare act of defiance, some of the survivors decide to write a letter of complaint to a local governor, criticising their commanders and reporting that they lost about 300 people killed, wounded and missing, as well as half the equipment in 4 days. Excerpts of the letter surface online, with even hardened Russian nationalists calling out the Kremlin's incompetent tactics and forcing the country's Ministry of Defense into making a statement, attempting to downplay the gravity of the situation. It wasn't the first time Russia's tactical incompetence had been made public in this war, but it was one of the most high-profile examples of the country's commanders throwing men into the meat grinder, suffering severe losses due to a lack of preparation and care. Still, despite their losses, the Russians refused to give up. Instead, they doubled down. Commanders continue to funnel men and armour towards the village, hoping that the sheer weight of their force eventually proves too much for Ukraine's defenders to cope with. On November 11th, after gradually grinding down Ukraine's defences, Russian sources announced that they had taken control of the village, which was confirmed by the country's Ministry of Defense a couple of days later. It took around 2 weeks and cost the lives of hundreds of soldiers from the 155th Brigade, but Russia had achieved the first part of the plan. Part 2, the actual taking of Vuhledar, would prove to be a far greater challenge. On that freezing morning of January 24, 2023, General Rustam Muradov ignores the blood soaked into the ground at Pavlivka and orders his army directly up the same dirt tracks. By the end of the first wave, the battlefield is clogged with the smoking remains of tanks and vehicle chassis. Many of them run right over TM-62 mines that have been placed along the roads and choke points leading towards the city. As lead tanks hit these mines, entire columns come grinding to a halt, blocking the paths for the vehicles behind them. They then become sitting ducks for Ukrainian anti-tank troops, who emerge from hiding places, launching the likes of Javelins and next-generation light anti-tank weapons to pick off the stranded infantry vehicles at the back. Any Russians still left alive are trapped between the mined tanks in front of them and the smouldering remains of the troop carriers behind. Other vehicles try to move in to assist with evacuation and recovery, but they too are exposed as Ukrainian artillery fire rains down from above, and surveillance drones hover overhead to provide pinpoint coordinates of where to strike. Realizing that they'll surely die if they stay there any longer, Russian soldiers make the bold move to dismount and rush across the open fields while explosions ring out around them. Muradov watches on in horror as his tactical inflexibility is exposed, but it's too late to back down now. He urges more tanks and fighting vehicles into the fray. With the roads blocked, some of these vehicles opt to veer off the tracks and into the open fields, assuming or perhaps hoping that they haven't been mined. They don't realise that Ukraine's defenders anticipated this too, and are actively firing even more remote anti-armour mines into the area with the aid of their howitzers. These specialised 155mm artillery rounds are designed to scatter 9 small anti-tank mines across wide areas, allowing Ukraine to instantly create new minefields. As more Russian columns advance, Ukraine transforms the terrain around them into inescapable death traps. They can't advance, they can't retreat, and panic soon sets in, with more Russian crews abandoning their vehicles and fleeing for their lives. Days pass like this, with Russia's relentless assaults being routed by Ukrainian defences. The city suffers hits too, with Russia's rockets and tank cannons blowing holes in the old Soviet apartment towers and other structures that still stand. But the Kremlin's losses are far greater than those on the Ukrainian side, with numerous media outlets reporting dozens of vehicles wiped out per day, like on February 13th, when at least 31 armoured vehicles were eliminated by a single Ukrainian ambush. Wave after mechanised wave fails to achieve the desired effects, and the number of lost troops and assets continues to spiral. Online, images and videos spread, showing the smouldering remains of T-80 tanks and blown-out BMPs, while the bodies of fallen Russian soldiers litter the fields. By the first week of February, Russia's 155th Naval Infantry has been decimated. Its elite Pacific Fleet soldiers have been hurriedly replaced with new recruits who have only weeks of training to their name, and they too continue to be killed and wounded in huge quantities. Morale collapses, and despite near constant assaults, Ukraine's 72nd Brigade maintains control of Vuhledar. But Muradov won't give in. He has devoted his life to the Russian army, rising from a platoon commander in the 1990s to being named a hero of the Russian Federation by Vladimir Putin. But now, in the face of a complete tactical failure, his reputation is at risk. To ensure that his troops remain on course for their objective, he resorts to desperate measures. Russian prisoners of war captured around this period reveal that their commanding officers began deploying so-called barrier or anti-retreat troops, squads of soldiers stationed behind the main assault units, with the express order to shoot any Russian who dares to retreat without authorization. Russia is effectively forcing its own troops into the firing lines at gunpoint, sending their men to their deaths without any hope of survival. General Muradov's reputation is in tatters. Russian Z bloggers repeatedly call out his cowardice and incompetence as his wasteful tactics result in even more devastating losses of lives, tanks and other vehicles, the single most concentrated loss of Russian armour since the start of the war. Every day is a repeat of the one that came before. More troops and tanks are sent in, only to be destroyed in the hours that follow. No gains are made as Ukraine's entrenched defenders continue to dig in even further. The entire battle becomes a microcosm of the larger war, a stark example of Russia's inflexible tactics and inability to adapt to the situation in front of it, as it repeatedly burns through men and weapons while failing to turn its numerical supremacy into any other sort of on-ground advantage. This cannot go on forever, but the siege is only just beginning. After dozens of disastrous assaults, the Russian command finally decides to abandon its strategy. Since Russian forces aren't able to get close to the city, their commanders decide the next best option is to level it from a distance. Throughout the summer and autumn of 2023, Vuhledar experiences a very different kind of warfare, with Ukraine's defenders having to deal with small-scale infantry advances and random probing attacks from different directions. Russia also makes use of long-range artillery fire and UMPK glide bombs, Soviet-era dumb bombs that have been fitted with GPS guidance kits. It's slow, attritional, grinding warfare, and it takes its toll. While Ukraine is still able to leverage its advantages like minefields, FPV drones and fortified positions to deal with a large part of Russia's attacks and prevent any swift or significant territorial gain, the impact of the artillery and bombing runs is clear to see. The multi-story apartment buildings that Ukraine once used as observation towers to keep tabs on their enemies' movements are leveled one after the other. Meanwhile, additional Russian assault groups pivot away from the main force along the highway to the south and around towards other nearby villages, like Pavlivka, hoping to sever the supply lines feeding the city's defenders and open up new axes of attack. If they can do that, the fortress may finally turn into a tomb. By September 2024, the reality of the siege starts to catch up with the defenders. The men of the 72nd Separate Mechanized Brigade have held this single city for over 2 years. They have maintained their positions, digging into anchored locations and fending off innumerable Russian assaults, using the high points of the city's buildings to gather intelligence and help them prepare for the next wave of tanks and troops. They've built a complex, layered system of defences, including trench lines, anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth obstacles and dense minefields. They funneled the Russians into kill zone corridors, using their own network of underground bunkers and communications tunnels to continue operating even when taking heavy fire from bombs and artillery. When the Russians changed their tactics, Ukraine's defenders adapted, shifting towards more of a focus on drone strikes and small arms fire against the small squadron of troops that the Kremlin's commanders sent their way. But now their reserves of energy, strength and supplies have been diminished. Ammunition is running low, morale is dropping, and the defences that have helped these soldiers survive are being eroded one by one. Those that remain are malnourished and sleep-deprived, surviving in flooded basements and burnt-out buildings, living on the few rations that they can scrape together. They can no longer hold the perimeter. Russian forces managed to break through to the east, capturing one of the city's coal mines and in the process gaining their own patch of high ground from which they can look down across the rest of the city. On September 25th, more Russians reach Vuhledar's western edge. The pincers are in place. All that's left is to squeeze them shut. In the days that follow, Ukraine's troops receive the order that they managed to delay for so long, the order to withdraw. In small groups and under the cover of smoke grenades and darkness, they attempt to make their escape while Russian FPV drones swarm across the skies to hunt them down. On October 1st, 2024, the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade, that very same one that Ukraine had managed to stop so many times before, enters the city, raising the Russian flag over what remains of Vuhledar, once a peaceful mining town, now a smouldering shell. It's a victory, but a hollow one, and one that came at a catastrophic cost. While the Russian troops who survived the assault were able to celebrate, thousands of their fellow countrymen have perished in the process. The 155th was effectively destroyed several times over, with General Muradov eventually dismissed from his post, doomed to have his name forever associated with the tank graveyard his incompetent tactics helped create. In total, estimates suggest that Russia lost well over 100 pieces of armour, as well as several thousand of its most experienced soldiers, for a town where almost no buildings remain. The country's losses were so severe that this single battle impacted Russia's entire wartime strategy from that point on. The Institute for the Study of War noted that Russian commanders all along the front lines subsequently began using fewer and fewer mechanized assaults, relying less on tanks and infantry vehicles and more on drones and bombs, as they were so fearful of suffering those same kinds of failures again. Ukraine, meanwhile, experienced a fraction of Russia's losses. Despite having fewer men and resources to call on, Ukraine's defenders showed that even in an age of heavy explosives and unmanned aerial vehicles, hilltop fortresses with long lines of sight are just as difficult to destroy as they were centuries ago. The Battle of Vuhledar cost Russia over 100 pieces of armour to take an empty graveyard, accelerating a permanent shift toward the asymmetric drone warfare that is now actively neutralising their multi-billion-dollar supply chains. To see how a $90,000 hobby plane flew 1,100 miles into a radar blind spot to cripple a $40 million nuclear bomber, click this video right here. And we'll see you on the next battlefield.